I never imagined I would one day be telling this story, a story that changed everything I thought I knew about my life. A story of betrayal, of family, of silence and fear that lasted for decades. A story that began with a will and ended with the collapse of everything my father had built. Even now, 3 years later, I can still feel the weight of that moment. It sits inside me, quiet but heavy, reminding me every day of what I had to survive and what I finally had the courage to confront. So let me take you back through my own memories to the moment it all began. My name is Sophie Anderson, and I am 38 years old. I am the only daughter in a family with 4 sons: Robert, James, Christopher, and Nathan. My mother got married at 21, right after college, and over the following years she gave birth to 5 children, one after another. My brother Robert was born when she was 22, James at 24, me at 26, Christopher at 29, and Nathan at 32. My father wanted a big family, a dynasty. My mother gave him what he demanded until her body finally said enough. We grew up in a small town called Riverview, Washington, in a 3-story Victorian house with turrets and stained glass windows. My father demanded that the house always look perfect. The white facade was repainted every 2 years, the boxwood hedge trimmed weekly. It was his obsession with control, and it extended to every detail of our lives. I remember the smell of that house, a mix of furniture polish, my father's tobacco, and my mother's perfume. For others, those scents might have meant home. For me, they meant a cage. Every morning I woke up to the sound of my father's footsteps, heavy, measured, marking time like a metronome. 7 o'clock shower. 7:30 breakfast. 8 departure for the office. Not a minute earlier, not a minute later. Our father, William Anderson, owned the largest logistics company in the state, Anderson Logistics. He had started with 1 truck and turned it into an empire with a fleet of 3,000. His fortune was valued in tens of millions of dollars. To the town, he was the embodiment of the American dream, a self-made millionaire, a philanthropist, sponsor of the local baseball team. To us, he was a man whose approval was as unreachable as the summit of Everest. I remember his hands huge, with a scar across his left palm for military service. Those hands signed million-dollar contracts, but they never patted me on the head. When I was 6, I fell off my bike and scraped my knee. I ran to him, crying, blood running down my leg. He looked over the top of his newspaper and said, "Boys don't cry." I reminded him I was a girl. He went back to reading as if I had ceased to exist. My mother, Elizabeth, was a ghost in her own house. A beautiful woman with chestnut hair and green eyes, she had once dreamed of becoming a writer. I found her manuscripts in the basement, simple stories about women, about love, about relationships. She stopped writing the day she got married. From that day on, her life no longer belonged to her. Over the years, she learned to anticipate my father's wishes before he even voiced them. His shirts ironed to military precision. His steak medium rare, not a second more. His whiskey 2 fingers, 3 ice cubes. She moved through the house like a shadow, silent and invisible. I saw her taking pills, white ones in the morning, blue ones in the evening. I saw her hiding bruises under foundation and long sleeves. Once, when I was 14, I found her crying in the bathroom. She held a towel to her split lip. She said she had slipped. We both knew it was a lie, but I accepted the rules of the game. In our house, everyone wore masks. My brothers fell into a strict hierarchy, like soldiers in formation. Robert, the eldest, 42, was a carbon copy of our father. Vice president of the company, married to a state senator's daughter. They had 4 straight children who played lacrosse and went to Yale. At family dinners, my father looked at him with the pride of a man showing off a prize stallion. Robert inherited not only my father's looks, but also his cruelty. As a child, he locked me in the basement when our parents weren't home. I sat there for hours in the dark, listening to the scratching of mice. When I told my mother, She said boys will be boys. That was when I stopped complaining, because my mother pretended nothing was happening. My brother James, 40, became the company's chief financial officer. Cold, calculating, he could lay off 1,000 employees and still calmly finish his lunch. He married for money to the heiress of an oil fortune. Their marriage was a business deal. She got a family, he got her father's connections. There was never any love between them. My brother Christopher, 36, ran the legal department. A brilliant lawyer, he could find a loophole in any contract, circumvent any law. But behind the brilliance was emptiness. He drank quietly, methodically, pouring whiskey over something that had died inside him long ago. At corporate parties, his wife smiled while he staggered, and in the mornings his secretary cancelled meetings because of his headaches. My brother Nathan, the youngest, 35, handled international shipments. Of all my brothers, he was the only one who had any trace of humanity left. Sometimes, when no one was watching, he gave me a real smile. But he too was broken. At 18, he wanted to be a musician. My father snapped his guitar over his knee without a word. Nathan never played again. And me? I was the mistake. The unplanned child born between the heirs of the empire. A girl in a world where only boys were valued. In family portraits, I was placed at the edge, sometimes cut halfway out of the frame. On my father's desk stood photographs of my brothers in mahogany frames. Mine wasn't there. But I survived. In spite of everything, I built my own life. I became a landscape designer and opened Sophie Gardens. My projects were published in Better Homes and Gardens. I created gardens for wealthy Seattle homes, oases of beauty in the concrete jungle. But to my father, it was a hobby, a woman's indulgence not worth his attention. As a child, I brought home certificates and medals. First place at the science fair. Student council president. A full scholarship to university. My father tossed them into his desk drawer without looking. When Robert got his MBA, my father threw a reception for 200 people. When I defended my thesis with honors, he went on a business trip. He left town on purpose that day. At 26, I married David, a programmer from California. Kind, smart, everything my father wasn't. At the wedding, my father gave a speech about how I was now in good hands, as if passing off a faulty product. David lasted 7 years. He couldn't take my demands, the expectations, the family dinners where he was ignored, the humiliations my father disguised as jokes. When he left, I didn't cry. Some people aren't made for marriage, and maybe I was one of them. Life went on until one day everything changed. My father turned 74. A week earlier, doctors had diagnosed him with terminal liver cancer. The metastasis had spread everywhere. 3 months, maybe 6, that was the verdict. And what did he do? He called an emergency family meeting. I remember every second of that evening. The air was heavy with the coming storm. The house smelled of lemon pie my mother always baked when she was nervous, as if sugar glaze could sweeten bitter truth. I sat in the same living room where I used to hide behind the couch, eavesdropping on adult conversations. The illness was eating my father from the inside, leaving only a shell. His skin had the yellow tint of old parchment. His suit, once perfectly tailored, now hung loose. But his eyes, steel, cold, were unchanged. They held no fear of death, only irritation that the disease had interrupted his plans. He spoke for 43 minutes. First about the diagnosis, dry, businesslike, as if discussing a quarterly report. Then about the company, the transfer of power. And finally about his will. My brother Robert, the eldest, got 35% of the shares and the position of president. My brother James, the second eldest, got 25%. Christopher and Nathan each got 15%. The house went to Robert. The art collection to James. The yacht to Christopher. The oceanfront house to Nathan. 10% of the shares went to the William Anderson Foundation, a fund named after my father. But my name was not mentioned, not once. Can you imagine? My name was not spoken. The silence after his words dragged on. I heard the ticking of the grandfather clock, my mother's breathing, the pounding of my own heart. My brothers glanced at each other, unsure whether to feign grief or joy. My mother studied, her hands folded in her lap, the same hands that once played Chopin. I forced myself to ask. My voice sounded foreign, hoarse, as if I hadn't spoken in years. What about me? Does your only daughter deserve nothing, get nothing? My father looked at me with genuine surprise, as if he had forgotten I existed. Then his lips stretched into a smile, the same smile that had sent me hiding under my blanket as a child. He said I should be grateful I grew up in comfort. That if I married well, my husband would take care of me. My mother tried to say something for the first time that evening. My father looked at her, and she fell silent, as if he had switched off her sound. My brothers said nothing. Even Nathan looked away. I stood. My legs trembled, but I forced myself to walk straight. At the doorway, I turned back. I had ceased to exist the moment I asked the question. They were already discussing details, who would take which office, how to divide the clients. I walked out into the October night without an umbrella. Rain lashed my face, mixing with tears I could no longer hold back. I sat in my car and stared at the house where I had grown up. Warm light glowed in the windows. In that moment, I was shattered. Shattered so completely I cannot even put it into words. But that was only the beginning of my story. You cannot imagine what came next. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived that changed everything. A letter from a man I had believed dead for 15 years. That letter came exactly 2 weeks after the fateful family gathering. The mailman knocked on my apartment door unusually early, at 7 in the morning. I remember that morning well. The fog wrapped the neighborhood in a heavy shroud. Regular mail was always left in the box downstairs, but this envelope required a personal signature. A thick ivory-colored envelope, my name written in ink, not printed, but handwritten. The return address made me read the name twice. Marcus Stone, Law Office, Tacoma. Marcus Stone, a man I had believed dead for the past 15 years. Marcus had been my mother's first love. She once told me about him when my father was away on a long business trip after she had drunk too much wine. Back then, she and Marcus had been dating in college and were even planning a wedding. But then my father appeared charismatic, ambitious, unwilling to take no for an answer. And Marcus simply vanished. Vanished, and no one knew where he was or what had happened to him. In the end, my mother married my father 3 months after Marcus's disappearance. I tore the envelope open with trembling hands. Inside was a 3-page letter and another sealed envelope marked open after reading the main letter. Marcus wrote that he had been watching our family all these years. He knew about the death of my maternal grandmother 10 years ago. He knew about my divorce. He knew about my father's diagnosis. And most importantly, he knew the truth about how my father built his empire. It turned out the starting capital for the first truck had not come from my grandfather, as the family legend claimed. The money had belonged to Marcus, an inheritance from his father, who owned a small transportation company. My father had stolen not only the woman Marcus loved, but also his money, his business plan, and his entire client base. Marcus wrote that he had proof. Bank documents, letters, even a recording of my father bragging about his victory. He had gone to Canada, started a new life under another name. But he had continued to gather evidence, waiting for the right moment. And that moment had come. Marcus offered me a deal. He would hand over all the documents that could challenge my father's right to the company. In return, I had to do one thing and tell my mother the truth. Give her a chance at freedom. I opened the second envelope. Inside was a photograph of a young Marcus and my mother laughing in front of a university campus. My mother looked alive, real, happy the way I had never seen her. And a note, She deserves to know that I am alive, that she has a choice. Address for meeting, Café Rainy Day on 5th Avenue, Tacoma. I'll be there every Tuesday at 3 o'clock. Sign, Marcus. I sat down on the floor right in the hallway, pressing the letters to my chest. My head spun from the truth that had just unfolded. My father's entire empire was built on theft. The man my mother could have loved all her life was alive, and I held in my hands the key to destroying everything my father had built. The next 3 days I spent in a strange stupor. I went to work, met with clients, discussed garden projects. But my thoughts always returned to the letter, to the photograph of my happy mother, to the possibility that now lay open. On Monday evening, Nathan called. His voice was strange, tense, almost frightened. He told me that my father had held a close meeting with Robert and James. They were discussing some preventive measures regarding me. Nathan overheard a fragment of the conversation, something about how I could cause problems and that they needed to secure the assets. Nathan warned me to be careful. He said that Robert had hired a private detective to follow me, that James was reviewing all my financial transactions from the past 5 years. They were planning something, even though they could not have known about Marcus's letter. On Tuesday morning, I called in sick at work and drove to Tacoma, a city near Seattle. The whole way, I kept checking the rearview mirror. Was someone following me? Paranoia, drilled into me by years in the Anderson family, had reached its peak. Café Rainy Day turned out to be a small, cozy place with fogged-up windows and the smell of fresh pastries. I arrived an hour early, took a table in the corner where I could see the entire room. I ordered coffee but couldn't bring myself to drink even a sip. My hands shook so much I spilled sugar across the table. Exactly at 3 o'clock, a man walked in. Gray hair, wrinkles around his eyes, but I recognized him from the photos in my mother's college album. Marcus Stone, a ghost from the past, alive and real. He sat across from me, and in his eyes I saw the same pain I had seen in my mother's all these years. The pain of a stolen life, unfulfilled love, betrayed hopes. Marcus talked for 2 hours, about how my father had planted drugs on him and set him up with the police, how he threatened to put him behind bars if he didn't disappear, how he took his business plan and presented it as his own, how he married my mother, knowing she loved another. But Marcus saved the worst for last. My paternal grandmother had not died of a stroke, as we had been told. She had discovered the truth about the stolen money and tried to stop my father. Marcus showed me a copy of her letter to the police, which had never been sent. A week after writing it, my grandmother was dead. No autopsy was performed. My father insisted on a quick cremation. Marcus handed me a folder full of documents, thick, heavy with secrets and proof. Bank statements, letters, photographs, even audio recordings. Enough to destroy my father's reputation, challenge his right to the company, possibly even trigger criminal charges. He asked if I would tell my mother. I nodded, unable to speak. He wrote his phone number on a napkin, said he would wait for her call, that he had never stopped loving her, that he was ready to wait as long as it took. When I left the cafe, the rain had started, a cold October rain that cut to the bone. I sat in my car, staring at the city lights blurred by the water. In the trunk lay the folder that could destroy my father's empire. In my pocket the napkin with the phone number of the man who could once have made my mother happy. I came home late that evening. In the mailbox was another letter from my father's corporate attorney. An official notice that I was excluded from all corporate events and stripped of the right to enter the company's headquarters without special permission. My father was acting quickly, cutting me off from the family business completely. But he didn't know that I held in my hands his past, his crimes, his downfall. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table, spreading out Marcus's documents, drafting a plan. By morning I had made a decision. I would not just tell the truth, I would take it all. The company, built on blood and betrayal. The money stolen from the man who had loved my mother. The justice that had been awaited for decades. But first, I needed to talk to my mother. To tell her that the man she had mourned for 15 years was alive. That 15 years ago, Marcus had staged his own death in a car accident on a mountain road, the body never found. That she still had a chance at her real life, while it wasn't too late. That sometimes ghosts return not for revenge, but for salvation. In the morning, I called my mother. Told her I needed to speak to her urgently. Alone, without my father. She agreed to meet on Wednesday, when he would be at chemotherapy. I heard a note of fear in her voice. She sensed that change was coming. At that moment, I looked at the rising sun, painting the sky blood red. The war for the Anderson inheritance was only beginning. But now I had a weapon, and I was ready to use it. The night passed almost without sleep. I tossed and turned as if the walls were closing in on me, catching myself returning again and again to one thought. If I stayed silent now, I would betray myself and my mother. My mother's name is Elizabeth. She is the woman who lived her entire life beside my father, William Anderson, and just as many years in silence. I am Sophie, her daughter, the only woman among my father's 4 sons. I repeated these simple things in my mind so I wouldn't lose my footing. I repeated the simple facts like anchors, so I wouldn't drown in the noise of my own thoughts. The morning was damp but quiet. I left home early because I wanted extra time. Ahead of me was a conversation with my mother, not a short meeting, but a conversation that changes people. I drove slowly, every familiar turn seeming to remind me that today my mother and I would cross an invisible line. I chose a place where she would feel calmer. It was a small cafe on the outskirts, where she sometimes went in her younger years, when I was in elementary school. Back then, she would take me there on Saturdays. We shared a big warm cinnamon muffin, and I felt that in those short hours my mother came alive and became herself again. Now I returned there not for a muffin. I came for another purpose. I arrived early inside at a table by the window. I always sit by the window, because I need to see how people enter, how the street moves, how the light changes. It isn't paranoia without cause. It's a way of telling myself the truth. The world is around me, and I am not alone in it. But I noticed my fingers trembled with a faint shake, as if from cold, though the cafe was warm. I placed my bag on the table. Inside was the folder of documents Marcus Stone had given me, my mother's first love, the man I had believed dead. Next to it, a thick envelope with a photograph and a short note that promised my mother not revenge, but the possibility of choice. I checked again that everything was in place and closed the bag. On days like this you check twice, so as not to fail because of some small mistake. My mother arrived. I saw her reflection in the glass before I heard her steps. It's strange how over the years a person learns to walk so the noise doesn't disturb. She sat down across from me. My mother, Elizabeth, a woman with green eyes that for many years looked not at people but at the floor, at the table, at curtains, at folds of tablecloth. Today those eyes looked at me. That meant more than words. I began. I spoke simply, because complicated phrases break the meaning and confuse the heart. I am her daughter. She is my mother. My father, William, did not build his business by his own labor, but with stolen money and a stolen plan. Marcus, the man she loved in her youth. He is alive. He waited. He gathered proof. I placed before her the photograph of her young and free, next to the man she once lived for. I saw her breathing change, saw for a moment the strength disappear that had kept her pain locked inside for so many years. I didn't ask her to speak. I only needed one thing, that she look at the truth and not turn away. Time flows differently in such conversations. I told her everything I knew and had seen myself. I told her how I had met Marcus. I told her he was ready to help. I told her about my paternal grandmother, about her letter to the police, about the rushed cremation without autopsy that my father had demanded. I didn't add extra colors. I simply placed stones of fact on the table, building a path that could lead to a door. That door was my mother's freedom. I saw in her eyes the kind of pain that cannot be mistaken for anything else. Pain that carries hope. Pain that is not empty. My mother had always been a quiet person, but not a weak one. I told her that my brother Nathan, the youngest of my father's 4 sons, and I felt danger. Nathan warned me that our father had been holding close meetings with Robert and James. Robert, the eldest, a copy of our father in character. James, the financier, cold and quick in decisions. Both feared most of all losing control. Both were ready to do anything to hold on to it. I explained to my mother in simple words, they are putting pressure on us. I may be followed. My accounts may be scrutinized. I wasn't exaggerating. I simply called things by their names. When a person walks a narrow path, it's better to see where the cliff is. I suggested a plan, one even someone unused to plans could follow. First, safety. Safety for my mother and for me. Not about bodyguards or grand words. About small steps that make the path safer. I asked her, for now, not to stay home alone when my father was at work, but to always take with her phone, documents, and keys. I asked her to carry copies of important papers and keep the originals somewhere my father didn't know. I asked her to tell me where she was going and check in when she arrived. It sounded simple, but simple things are reliable. When someone has lived with danger for years, simple rules become a shield. Then the truth. I told her and myself, truth is not a shout. Truth is a document, a signature, a record, a date, an account, a letter. We had it. In the folder, bank statements, letters, photos, audio recordings, a trail of money that no pretty words could erase. I understood we would need a lawyer, one unconnected to my father and independent of his influence. I made a short list of names that might help. I didn't say them aloud. I kept them in my head. Sometimes it's better to keep a list inside, like a password. For my mother, this was a chance to admit honestly, life wasn't over. The man she had loved was alive. He had waited. He was ready to meet and to help. I didn't push her. I only placed beside her hand a small rectangle of paper with one line written on it. A phone number. That small thing weighed more than it seemed. The weight wasn't in grams, it was in years. We sat a long time. I felt time stretching its shoulders. My mother didn't ask questions, because sometimes questions break fragile decisions. I saw her listening to herself, to her memories, to the way her heart beat now, not yesterday. I knew she remembered her first dress, her first stories, the first applause on the little stage of the student theatre that had once been her home. I knew she remembered the girl of 20, not the woman raised by the darkness of our house. When we rose from the table, the world outside seemed to have changed. The autumn air was cooler. The leaves on the trees looked larger, shining after rain. I walked my mother to her car and stood until she drove off. I knew this day had put her life on new rails. I didn't know if she would choose to meet Marcus now or later. I knew only this, she had taken her fate in her own hands. That was enough, but peace is a rare thing in our world. I returned home closer to evening. The sky had grown heavy, sea air carried dampness. I lived alone in silence. I loved to listen to raindrops against the window ledge, the neighbor's dog bark once and fall silent, a distant train stretch its long note. This time the silence was different. A silence in which something had changed. The door was locked. The lock intact. Nothing broken. But the air in the hallway smelled of someone else. It could be any smell, cheap cologne, foreign hand cream, dust from another cabinet. I smelled a stranger and understood at once someone had been here. I took off my coat and slowly walked to the kitchen. On the table lay an old photograph. A photo from one of our family gatherings, when our house still seemed like a fortress. In the photo, my father stood in the center. Beside him, my brothers were Robert, James, Christopher, and Nathan. My mother held her hands folded with a neutral expression. I was the girl at the edge, cut halfway out of the frame. That photo had always stood in my father's office, in a heavy mahogany frame. I had never had it in my home. I picked up the photograph. On the back, only 2 words were written, "You're next." The handwriting was uneven, as if written in haste. I needed no explanation. These words were not a greeting and not a request, they were a threat. I understood at once. I was being watched, my steps known, and the message was clear. I was the target now. I set the photo on the table and tried to breathe evenly. I was scared, and I didn't try to hide it. But I understood. If I stayed only in fear, I would do nothing. I needed to gather myself. I opened the window to let in fresh air. I called Nathan and left a short voice message without details, but with clear meaning. We needed to meet tomorrow morning in a crowded place, without hurry, without extra eyes. Nathan, the one who still knew the difference between right and wrong, even if he kept silent more often than he spoke. I also texted my mother that I was home safe. I didn't mention the photograph. Her heart already trembled too often. Then I turned on the desk lamp, pulled out Marcus's folder, and arranged everything by groups. I love order in papers because order saves in chaos. On the left I placed the bank statements. Separate the letters. Separate the photographs. Separate the audio files and transcripts. I opened a notebook and wrote at the top, money trail. Under that line, I started noting down in plain words, without professional terms, so anyone could understand where and when the sums moved, who owned the accounts, what date the deposits were opened, whose signatures appeared. I connected facts so the picture would become whole. Only a complete picture can withstand outside blows. Then I wrote a second line, people and roles. Under it I listed everyone who mattered. William, my father, owner of the logistics company, a man who feared not death, but loss of control. Robert, eldest son, my brother, the de facto heir of power. James, my brother, who held the finances and knew how to hide tracks. Christopher, my brother, a lawyer always seeking loopholes. Nathan, my younger brother, the one who still remembered what conscience was. My mother, Elizabeth, a woman whose past had been stolen. Marcus, the man whose life had been stolen, but not broken. I, Sophie, the daughter who no longer agreed to be a blank space at the edge of the frame. It was all written simply, without fancy phrases. I worked deep into the night. I didn't look at the clock. I paused only to drink water. The fear never fully left, but it stopped commanding me. Fear always rushes, but truth moves slowly, yet firmly. Toward dawn, exhaustion took me. Heavy, strong. I turned off the lamp and lay on the couch, still dressed. The street lights were still out, but the sky was already gray. I closed my eyes and thought that today could be a day I would remember for the rest of my life. Today I wanted to make 2 simple steps. First, meet Nathan and hear what he knew and what he could do. Second, to help my mother make her choice. I understood that my father would thrash like a man whose reins were being pulled from his hands. That thrashing was dangerous. But I was no longer the one who looked away. I woke to my phone vibrating softly in my pocket. A system notification. On the screen, an alert from my banking app, where I kept savings from my small studio, where I designed my sketches. The message said an attempt to log in from an unknown device had been denied. At first, I didn't understand. Then I reread slowly. The alert repeated a second time. I had no doubt who was trying to open what had been closed. I got up, turned on the lamp, and picked up my notebook. I wrote a new line, countermeasures. Under that line, I listed the things I would do in the morning. First, transfer copies of all files to an external drive kept outside my home. Second, to send an encrypted archive with the documents to a trusted person outside the family. Third, to close access and change passwords wherever I had forgotten to before. Fourth, contact an independent lawyer and book a consultation. Fifth, call my mother and confirm whether she was ready for a quiet meeting on neutral ground. Then I went to the kitchen and turned on the kettle. When the water began to boil, I caught myself listening to the sound. In simple morning things there is peace, the water boils, the day begins, and I do what I must. I took out a mug with the name of my studio printed on it. 2 simple English words I once chose to remind myself, even in stone quarters, life can grow. I held the mug, thoughts swarming in my head. On the table lay the photograph. I didn't put it back. I carried it into the room and placed it on the far shelf of the closet, where I kept a box of things from the past. That box wasn't trash. It was a memory box. I put the things I needed to remember, but not keep at hand. It was easier that way. With the first rays of sun, the city began to stir. I gathered the documents, grabbed my bag, and left. Cars in the parking lot were covered in a fine net of drops. I got into my old but reliable car, which had been with me many years. I love things that don't abandon you. I started the engine and drove toward the center, where Nathan and I had chosen to meet. We had picked a corner in a large park that half the city frequented. There were always many people there. On the way, my phone rang with an unknown number. I didn't answer. It rang a second time, then went silent. I don't like uncertainty, but this time I decided not to pick up. I arrived at the park. The air smelled of wet grass. People walked their dogs, jogged, led children to school. I parked, sat on a bench, placed my bag beside me. I felt my heart beating faster than usual. I waited for my brother. Nathan, my father's youngest son, the one who at 16 dreamed of being a musician but once heard would snap over a knee and stop believing sound could be kind. He walked toward me slowly. When he sat down beside me, I felt half the tension leave my body. The other half stay ready for later. I told Nathan only what was needed, enough for him to understand how serious this was, without putting at risk myself, our mother, or him. I knew he already lived within a caution. That caution wasn't cowardice. It was wisdom born of pain. We sat side by side, watching the first sunbeam touch the branches. Sometimes it's easier to look at trees than people, at least trees don't lie. And just then I noticed movement near the parking lot. An unremarkable grey car stood there, and I saw the window shift slightly. Sometimes a person doesn't need proof to understand something simple. They're being watched. It wasn't panic. It was knowledge. I placed my hand on my bag. Inside was the folder that could destroy my father's empire. Beside it in my phone, waiting for my mother's call if she decided to take her step. The birds grew loud. Trees seemed to lean in a little to witness and hear what would happen next. I stood and told myself that fear was no reason to leave the road. I looked at the path leading out of the park and thought that every exit is also an entrance. I knew after today we would enter a new phase. A phase where my father would play harder. A phase where money and connections became weapons. But I had another weapon. One that cannot be bought or sold. That weapon was truth. When I reached my car, I saw an envelope under the wiper. Thick ivory-colored paper. No stamps. No address. Only my name written clearly and firmly. I took the envelope in my hand. I didn't open it right away. I placed it in my bag because I understood something simple. Some letters are better not read immediately. I got into the car, started the engine, and drove out of the park. You cannot even imagine what I found in that envelope. I drove to the lawyer's office, but when I opened the envelope, I found a sheet of paper with my father's handwriting. On it were written the words, "You will repeat your grandmother's fate." I put it back and shoved it into the folder with the documents. Let it lie there among the other papers, a reminder that there was no turning back. At every traffic light, I felt my heart leap into my throat. When I stopped and saw that the grey car remained behind me, I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. But it was reality. The lawyer's office was in an old building. Inside it smelled of paper and wood. These smells were familiar, and they calmed me just a little. I sat in the reception area and felt my heart pounding, my palms growing damp. When I entered the office and spread the documents out in front of him, my hands trembled. I stared at the papers and barely heard what he was saying. I only caught a few words, enough to grounds a criminal. I understood the most important thing: we had a chance. When I left, the rain had started to drizzle again. The air was damp and heavy. I walked toward my car and felt someone behind me. The footsteps went fast but steady. I quickened my pace, my heart beating faster. A coldness spread in my stomach, my breath became short. I turned around and saw a man in a hood. He walked past, but I knew this was no coincidence. At home, in my mailbox, I found a new envelope. The paper was wet from the rain, with no stamp or address. Inside was a photograph. It was me standing at the entrance to the lawyer's office, taken from the side as if over someone's shoulder. On the back, 2 words were written, I see. The handwriting was familiar. I felt the blood drain from my face, my hand shaking so badly the photograph slipped to the floor. I picked it up. You cannot even imagine what awaited me next. The photograph with the words, I see, was the last warning. My silhouette at the lawyer's office shot over someone's shoulder. Robert's handwriting, I recognized it immediately. Broad, harsh, inherited from our father along with cruelty. The documents had already been in the lawyer's safe for 2 days. The process had begun. The prosecutor's office had received copies. My father's bank accounts were already being checked. But the family still didn't know the scale of the disaster about to fall on them. My mother's call caught me in the studio where I was working on a hospital garden project, trying to distract myself from waiting. Her voice trembled. My father had called an emergency family meeting. Everyone had to appear immediately. She said Robert knew something, that he had found something out. That my father was furious, though barely able to speak from illness. I drove to my parents' house, knowing this was the last meeting, the final act of the drama that had lasted my whole life. The grey car that had been following me in recent days no longer hid, it drove right behind me, brazen, open. Robert no longer concealed the surveillance. The house smelled of lemon pie and fear. My mother had baked all night. 3 pies sat on the kitchen table, a 4th in the oven. Her way of coping with horror was to create sweetness where there was none. Everyone was gathered in the living room. My father in his chair, a living corpse, yellow from jaundice, eyes sunken but still full of poison. Robert stood behind him, heir and executioner. James nervously checked his phone. The company's stock had already started to fall, though the news wasn't yet public. Christopher flipped through papers, but I saw his hands trembling. He had been drinking all night. Robert began without preamble. He laid photographs on the table. Dozens of shots of my life from recent weeks. Meeting Marcus at the cafe. Visiting the bank. The lawyer's office. Even the moment when I mailed the registered letter, the one with the key to the safe deposit box. He declared he had witnesses ready to testify that I had received money from competitors. That Marcus Stone was a front hired for a hostile takeover. That all my actions were corporate espionage and an attempt to destroy the family business out of spite toward my father. I sat in the chair opposite my father and just looked at him. I stayed silent. Let them speak. Let them pour out their version. It was already too late. My father spoke, his raspy voice barely breaking through his failing lungs. He called me a traitor, an ungrateful wretch, a mistake that should have been corrected long ago. He said I was destroying the legacy built with sweat and blood. I laughed. Quietly, but in the absolute silence of the room it sounded like a gunshot. Then I spoke. I told them what they didn't yet know. that the documents were already in the prosecutor's hands, that the case was open, that tomorrow morning there would be a search of the house, that the company's accounts were already frozen and James could check right now. James grabbed his phone, started calling the bank. His face grew grayer with every second of the conversation. He hung up and confirmed my words with a single line. The accounts were blocked. Then my mother spoke. She rose from her seat in the corner and walked up to my father. In her hands was a phone. She said she had just spoken with Marcus Stone, that he was alive, that he had waited all these years and was ready to testify, that she had her own evidence, diaries, photographs of bruises, recordings of threats, that she had also given them to the lawyer. I watched my father's world collapse before my eyes. Not just the business, the entire construct of his life. The wife he considered broken. The daughter he considered nothing. They had risen and destroyed him. Robert tried to shout something about family honor, about betrayal, but Christopher stopped him. He said that as a lawyer he understood if the case was lost. The evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses existed. The documents were genuine. The Anderson empire had fallen. My father rose from his chair. Or rather, he tried to. His legs gave way, and he clutched the armrests. His face twisted not only from physical pain. It was the agony of a man who had built a monument to himself his whole life and now saw it crumble into dust. He took a step toward me, raised his hand as if to strike. But the hand froze in the air, trembled, and dropped. In that moment he understood completely his power was gone. He was no one. Just a dying old man, facing disgrace in prison if he lived to see trial. The heart attack struck right there in the living room. My father clutched his chest, turned purple, began to collapse. Robert caught him. James called an ambulance. Christopher stood paralyzed. And I looked at the man who had terrorized our family for decades and felt only emptiness. Not joy, not satisfaction, emptiness. My mother came to me and embraced me. For the first time in many years, it wasn't a perfunctory hug, but a real one, warm, protective. She whispered that she was proud of me, that I had done what would have taken her another 30 years. The ambulance arrived 15 minutes later. They carried my father out on a stretcher, an oxygen mask over his face. Robert went with him. James and Christopher stayed in the house, not knowing what to do. The empire had collapsed, the king was dying, the heirs confused. The next morning, at exactly 7, the search began. Investigators, witnesses, experts. They seized documents, computers, even my father's personal diaries from the safe. Robert was arrested right in the hospital. He had tried to destroy documents at the company office during the night, but security cameras caught him. James surrendered without a fight. He offered full cooperation in exchange for leniency. His testimony added new episodes: money laundering, tax evasion, bribery of officials. Each admission was another blow to my father's reputation. Christopher disappeared for 3 days. He turned up in a rehabilitation clinic he had checked himself in, realizing that alcohol would kill him faster than disgrace. My father died 4 days later, never regaining consciousness. The nurse said that in delirium he called out to his mother, begged forgiveness. But it was too late. The one person he could ask forgiveness from had died long ago under strange circumstances. 19 people came to the funeral. The town that once worshipped William Anderson had turned away. Even business partners were afraid to appear, not wanting their reputation stained. My mother stood apart in a simple black dress, without the jewelry my father had forced her to wear like a collar. There were no tears in her eyes, only the relief of someone who had finally laid down an unbearable burden. A week after the funeral she met with Marcus. Not secretly, openly, in the same café where I had received the documents from him. I saw them through the window, 2 older people who looked at each other as if 35 years of separation, lies, and pain hadn't existed. My father's company ceased to exist 2 months later. The assets were sold off to cover debts. The house was demolished by its new owners. In its place, they built a kindergarten, ironic, and just at the same time. Robert received 7 years. James 3 years probation. Christopher avoided punishment but lost his law license. Now he gives free consultations to victims of financial fraud, his way of atoning. My mother was 64 when my father died. She married Marcus a year later. A quiet ceremony by the lake where they had planned to marry 35 years earlier. I stood beside them as they exchanged rings. My mother didn't cry, she smiled the smile I had only seen in old photographs of her youth. Now they live in a small house with a garden I designed especially for them. My mother is writing a book of the story of a woman who lost herself and found herself again. Marcus is her first reader and toughest critic. They argue over every comma and laugh like teenagers. My studio thrives. I design gardens for places where beauty is not a luxury but a necessity. Hospitals, hospices, nursing homes. Each garden is a small victory of life over death, beauty over ugliness. Yesterday I received a letter from Robert in prison. His first in 2 years. He wrote that he had finally realized our father was a monster. That we had all been his victims, each in our own way. That he wasn't asking forgiveness, he knew he didn't deserve it. He just wanted me to know. I didn't answer. Some bridges are burned forever. The story of the Anderson family ended the day William Anderson died. But the story of our real family, my mother's, mine, even my repentant brother's, was just beginning. My father wanted to build a dynasty. Instead, he built a house of cards that collapsed at the slightest touch of truth. He wanted immortality through legacy. He received the disgraceful fame of a fraud and probable murderer. And me? I gained freedom. The freedom to be myself, not the half-cut figure at the edge of a family photo. The freedom to love and be loved. The freedom to live without fear. This is my confession. The story of how the only daughter destroyed an empire of lies. Of how truth always finds its way. Of how sometimes destruction is liberation. In my garden, white roses bloom. I planted them on the day my father was buried. They grow on clean soil, fed by honest sun and rain. They are beautiful because they are real. Just like my life now. That's the end of today's story. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so share them in the comments below. I truly enjoy reading what you have to say. If you'd like more, check out the full playlist linked in the description of this video. New real stories are on the way, and I'd love to share them with you. Hopefully, I'll see you next time. If this journey resonated with you, please hit subscribe and tap the bell so you'll never miss the latest stories. Thank you for listening, and remember, even the hardest drama stories can end with freedom and dignity.